You are watching DHTV from California State University, Dominguez Hills.
Now, in this segment, we're going to be dealing with colonialism and the attitude towards race. Now, for nearly 2 centuries, immigrants were desired and adventurers were recruited through legal and extra-legal means to expand the influence of the Spanish, and then the French, and then the British interests in the Western Hemisphere. So these 3 major superpowers of Europe are going to come to the Western Hemisphere and lay claim to native lands. The arrival of the earliest European and African immigrants are relatively well documented. The historical record notes the arrival of the Spanish missionaries at St. Augustine in 1565 which eventually will become the United States. And then there's the Spanish settlement of New Mexico colony in 1598, which will eventually become the United States. And all of this was occurring prior to the founding of Jamestown in Virginia in 1607 and the arrival of the first slave in Virginia in 1619. So when we take a look at the traditional setting that most Americans remember about who arrived in the United States first, it's usually we visit the Pilgrims because we celebrate Thanksgiving here in the United States. It's the arrival of the Pilgrims in Massachusetts in 1620. Now it's celebrated as being the national symbol of early immigration. But it was in reality late in the period of initial European colonization that this territory, as I shared with you, later became part of the United States. But immigration, as we left off in the last segment, to what was to become the United States was so common that individual arrivals and the total number of immigrants went unrecorded. And hence, that cartoon that I shared with you on the last one about pre-revolutionary immigration, about imagining leaving it up to native peoples to create an immigration and labor policy. So this was true for nearly 2 centuries, during which immigration to the colonies and then to the United States was largely unregulated by these receiving governments. So labor formation, this is the key. Work experiences. These are important to remember. And the patterns that were developed in the colonial period eventually are going to reproduce themselves throughout United States history. So what is important to note for this class, especially as it pertains to the Chicano, the Mexicano, the Latin American immigrant experience, are those underlying attitudes towards race, these attitudes that come from the colonial period. So colonialism and the attitudes towards race that developed over time become important for us in our discussion over labor organizing and the treatment of immigrant labor forces today. Now, despite the fact that the United States is and always has been a nation of immigrants, we can understand that the immigration process, creates a variety of responses from various sectors of the U.S. population. So when we take a look at immigration, you know, there's fear, there's anxiety, there's sympathy, there's hate, there's misunderstanding, there's racial profiling, there's scapegoating, and there's xenophobia. And this is unfortunate because all of these anxieties can be traced back to the Spanish colonial heritage, to the British colonial heritage, to the French colonial heritage, and their respective attitudes towards race. When we take a look at the role of race in Spain, this is what we're going to be doing in this class, and then in England, these roles are very important to appreciate because beyond their religious practices, the English and the Spanish colonial worlds are going to diverge substantially in their attitudes towards native peoples and in their attitudes towards Africans, their attitudes towards slavery and race and labor formation. So it's very important for us to pay attention to these racial relations. Now, the Spanish are going to have a tradition of racial mixing. And so supposedly because of this tradition of racial mixing that we will encounter in this class, it became more acceptable for Spanish settlers to engage in sexual unions with both native peoples and Africans. But meanwhile, for the Anglo-Saxon colonies, for Great Britain, interracial mixing was considered a taboo by any class of whites. So race mixing is going to be banned in the British colonies. Race mixing is going to be banned in the United States until the civil rights movements of the 1950s and 1960s. So in the British colonies, while rape or unsanctioned unions obviously occurred, Anglo-Saxons almost never recognized their mixed race relations, no matter how light-skinned the offspring or how poor the father. And this was a difference, whereas the British, when they separated themselves from native populations and then they kept Africans in a plantation economy. So they had always separated themselves. This is not so with regards to the Spanish, where the Spanish are going to be intermingling. So just keep this in mind. Now let's understand something basic to native people's lives once Columbus does arrive in 1492. And that is known as the doctrine of discovery. Now, the doctrine of the discovery is the international law that governs European exploration and discovery of new lands around the world. And this doctrine is very important to appreciate because the doctrine is an international legal principle that allegedly grants European Americans property and sovereignty claims over native peoples. So if we can put down, or if you can bring that screen back up so we can understand Europe and the doctrine of discovery here. The sovereignty claims over native peoples and native lands. Because as soon as Europeans are going to arrive, to them, they're discovering these lands. So the doctrine plays an important part of American history and a very important part of modern day Indian law. Because the doctrine, again, if we can put that up on the bottom thirds or on the screen, if you have it on the bottom thirds, the doctrine provided under international law that newly arrived Europeans immediately and automatically acquired property rights in native lands and gained governmental, political, and commercial rights over the inhabitants. And this is known as the doctrine of discovery. So we can bring in that doctrine without the knowledge or consent. This was important. Without the knowledge and consent of native peoples. If we can bring that picture up so I can just emphasize there it is, that term, Europe and the doctrine of discovery. I'm just relating to it that right there. Because when Europeans and then Americans are going to plant their flags and their religious symbols over newly discovered lands, they're going to be demonstrating a legal claim to native territory. So it's in this way that nations of the Western Hemisphere are going to be able to usurp land for themselves through a legal process. If native peoples, of course, resisted these encroachments on their lands, then war was rationalized by Europeans, and then eventually all those people that call themselves Americans, whether it be North America, Central America, or South America, and they'll use war as a means to bring about the legal justification for conquest and colonization. So that doctrine of discovery laid the legal foundation for the occupation of the Western Hemisphere. So when Columbus did arrive, he's going to set off a chain reaction throughout the Americas. And this chain reaction is related to numerous events related to disease. Because in the 15th century, in 1492, the Europeans that arrive in the Western Hemisphere are going to introduce diseases, especially smallpox and measles, that devastated native communities. Pathogens do not need humans to spread. Once pathogens are introduced, they can follow established native trade routes out of the Caribbean and onto the mainland, whether it be South America, Central America, or North America. So Columbus had 4 voyages. And pathogens are going to enter and engulf the Caribbean, and they will enter Florida, they will enter Guatemala, they will enter Venezuela prior to the arrival of colonial settlers. So this is what's important to understand. So let's appreciate something about racism constructed, and let's move on to the next slide and understand why is it that Columbus is the one that's celebrated. Okay? Why Columbus? And we take a look at the different experiences. Now, what's important to appreciate is that when Columbus is arriving, there are a diversity of populations that are there was an error that I made a mistake. It should just be why Columbus, not and. That was my problem here. But there should be, and we should appreciate the diversity of populations that are going to be arriving. Now, Spain itself is diverse in its relationships because the Spanish are not pure-blood Spanish. They are Basques, they are Catalan, they are Catalonia, they are different linguistic traditions. They have Romanian influence, people from Romanov. They are Celts. Spain is a Celtic word meaning where the rabbits fall. So there's Greeks, there's Romans in the Spanish culture. And most importantly, there's the Moors, the Muslim influence. So, and then Jewish influence. So when we take a look at Spain, the Spanish that are going to be coming across are coming from a diverse cultural expression. And then likewise in Africa. When we take a look at the Africans that are going to be coming, they're going to be coming from the Nigerian Niger River system, where there are tremendous diverse populations speaking multiple languages. There's Yoruban, there's Ashanti, there's Mandinko, there's Ghanan. So the Africans are going to be coming across with rich cultural heritage. And then, of course, in the Western Hemisphere, there's all kinds of native populations. The Mexica are controlling a population base that includes numerous multilingual populations. The Mexica are creating an international language that they can communicate all the way from Nicaragua up here to Nevada in the United States. So the Mexica, just in central Mexico, there's all kinds of different languages that are being spoken, as there are to this day, with Mixtec and Zapotec, Tepehuanem, different kinds of languages, especially once you move north. So there's multiple traditions that are being provided in terms of the diversity of populations. And one area that I didn't include on that PowerPoint there is that I use Spain, Africa, and the Americas. I haven't incorporated Asia. This is the fourth dimension. Because one of the things is Magellan, when Magellan finally reaches the Philippines in Manila, or Manila in the Philippines, what's going to happen is the Chinese merchants, overlords or lords, are going to have enslaved the Filipinos, and they're going to be using different labor forces in Manila by which to create an international trading center in Manila, what eventually is going to be called Manila. But this population base included Cambodians, Japanese, Vietnamese, Southeast Asians groups, people from Thailand, and then people from Ceylon, which is within India. So in the Philippines, in Manila, there was an international trading center controlled by Chinese merchant class. Well, when the Spanish arrived, they're going to organize the peoples who are anti-Chinese, and the anti-overlords, and they're going to unite with the Spanish to overthrow them. But then the Spanish are going to impose their rule on there, and of course they're going to give the Philippines their name after King Philip, and that's why they're called the Philippines, the Filipinos. Well, the labor groups that are going to be formed there in the Philippines are going to find their way back to Mexico by the 1530s, 1540s, and they will be a significant part of the colonization of central Mexico. At first, they're going to be called Indios because they resembled native populations, and then they're going to be called Chinos to distinguish them from the Indios in central Mexico. But these Asian forces are Japanese, Cambodian, Korean, people, again, Southeast Asia. All these labor forces are going to enter Mexico City. So you're going to have this intermixture of red, white, black, ultimately creating brown, but that's what we all are about, is about being human. So that's very important. Now, one of the most important things that I have in the next statement is the age of exploration. When we take a look at the 15th and 16th centuries, especially in what is known as the Western Hemisphere. The age of exploration is important here because it's the age of exploration. That's what Europe calls. They're going around the world and they're exploring. Okay, in this age of exploration, I'm not at that. I'm not at that place. I'm in the second one of the previous slide, where it's the age of exploration, where it's racialized slavery. There we go. I'm introducing the term racialized slavery. Because in the age of exploration, what's most important is this is where the racialization process is constructed for all when Europe arrives in the Western Hemisphere, and likewise when they arrive in Africa and Asia. And remember when I talked about the beans, this is one of the reasons why I'm wearing this shirt, because it's a pretty good black, white, yellow, red, brown human. This is what happened in central Mexico at the time, interacting. But this term, age of exploration, with racialized slavery, it is in this era, we need to understand that the 16th century and the 17th century, right? 16th century, the 1500s. The 1500s is about Europe going around the world and just laying claim through the doctrine of discovery, all the lands of the world. Right? And that's what's most important to appreciate. That's why they call it the age of exploration, where they send out their quote-unquote explorers to go around the world. And in the process, they're going to introduce the racialization, racism. And so this is where it's very important that we're going to see slavery, which was used previously as a means by which to control labor forces. Now that slavery is conveniently going to become racialized. And that's what I mean by the term racialized slavery. Now native peoples and Africans are going to be put in a particular system, form and control labor forces. And this time now slavery is going to be identified by race. Slavery now will become perpetual, which will mean that it'll become a lifetime. That if you are enslaved, it becomes that you are going to be a slave for a life. This kind of slavery never existed before. And then finally, they will introduce hereditary slavery. So the new kind of racialized slavery, if we can get that back up on the map and take a look at the age of exploration. Under this age of exploration, which is the 16th century, 1500s, you know, colonies don't really start establishing themselves until 100 years later. So why they call it the age of exploration is because in the 1500s, Europe is going throughout the world, laying claim to the world. And that's one of the reasons why English is being spoken throughout the world today, Spanish in the Western Hemisphere, French, because those were the three main power groups, the Spanish, the French, and the British. One of the reasons why all those languages are being spoken throughout the world is because they're going to go throughout the world and they're going to introduce racialized slavery. They will create a slavery that will become perpetual, meaning a lifetime. So let's understand that. They will create a slavery that's going to become racially based, and then they will create a slavery that will be hereditary. So it'll be racial, perpetual, hereditary. Just understand that. Now, why Columbus? This is one of the reasons why I put why Columbus. How come Columbus is being given credit for it? Well, let's understand certain things about why Columbus comes onto the scene, because at that time, Europe is transforming. Europe is trying to find a way out of the control of the Muslim empire. The Muslims have controlled the Middle East. The Muslims are the controllers of goods that are coming from Asia. And European powers desire the products from Asia because, most importantly, they want the spices because that's a preservative. Spices are very important. The other is the silk, and the perfumes, everything, porcelain. All of these goods, the elite classes in Europe wish to consume. It's just that they're very expensive by the time that they move through the Middle East and into Europe. So what they're attempting to do is see if they can finance groups that might kind of make it across and find alternative routes to the Middle East, because the Middle East is controlled by Islam. And so it starts with the Portuguese, with Prince Henry the Navigator, who the Portuguese are able to go and round the Cape of Good Hope in Africa and then make their way over to India. So it just so happens that at this time, 1492 is such an important event because in 1492, the Spanish, two kingdoms, one under Ferdinand and another under Isabel, are going to unite to push the Moors out. And the year 1492 is so significant in Spain because at that time, Ferdinand and Isabel get together, push the Moors out, and then they implement a very important a program known as the Inquisition. You're either on our side or you're with the enemy. So Ferdinand and Isabella did not have any toleration for dissent. They did not tolerate any other kind of religion. It was going to be Catholicism, that was the religion. If you were Jewish, if you were Muslim, if you were any other kind of religion, you were not tolerated, you were rendered, you were sent to prison, you were put under the Inquisition, testing and questioning your faith. So this caused a lot of people to kind of fear what was occurring. Fear the administration of Ferdinand and Isabella as they united Spain into one entity. And so the Inquisition is very important because the Inquisition was a tool by which they could use to scare people into obedience. Because if you're not with us, then you must be with the enemy. All right? You're either with us or you're with the enemy. And if you're even have kind of any suspicion that you're not with us, then you will be sent to prison and you will be tortured. So this was a good way to create an acquiescent population. So who is Christopher Columbus? In 1492, with the Moors being pushed out, with the Inquisition in place, Christopher Columbus is Italian and he's Jewish. But Christopher Columbus is likewise a sailor, and he recognizes that the Portuguese have already have begun their travels, and he's going to be using Greek maps, and he's going to be using an astrolabe that was developed by the Muslims, because the Muslims control the Mediterranean. And so Christopher Columbus is going to go to Ferdinand and Isabella and going to say, hey, I have an alternative route for you. The world is round. If we go the other way, we can finally make it to India and we'll get the sources, the spices that you so desire. So Christopher Columbus sold Ferdinand and Isabella on a package deal. And so he got financing. And so this is Christopher Columbus, and on October 12th, Christopher Columbus landed in a place that is known as Hispaniola today. First it was the Bahama Islands, and then second was going to be an island that eventually will become Haiti and the Dominican Republic. So today, everybody, on October 12th, the United States and numerous countries celebrate Christopher Columbus. They call it Christopher Columbus Day. And Native Americans try to understand and counter that celebration by saying it was an invasion. And so since October 12th, there has been an intense debate over what to do on October 12th. Should you celebrate Christopher Columbus's discovery? According to the Europeans, they're using the doctrine of discovery by which to lay claim to the world. It's theirs now. And then Native peoples celebrating invasion, or understanding that this was an invasion because Europe did not discover. Europe came in to take what Native peoples had already. So this is why I put why Columbus and all of the different experiences of why Columbus. Okay, so now we're ready to move on to the next phase, is recognizing and initiating the age of exploration. Now let's take a look at the initiation of the age of exploration. Now you have to remember that racism is constructed in this time frame. There's the need to distinguish between us and them. So this concept of the frontier works very fine. The concept of a frontier, because the concept of a frontier, la frontera, creates a border between what will be known as civility and then the outside savagery, okay? So let's understand certain things about history. One of the things about history in the Western Hemisphere is that if you take a class at any university, all right, or if you take a history class in the high schools, history begins in 1492. So let's recognize that, okay? Let's recognize the racist construct that history has in itself as a field, as a discipline in the United States, in Canada, in Mexico, in Central America, in South America. Because if you want to learn anything about native peoples prior to 1492, you take anthropology, you don't take history. History doesn't deal with anything before 1492. So there you should already understand this, the need to distinguish between us versus them. And so when Europe comes, they create borderlines. Europe arrives and they create a line, an imaginary line, where they bring civilization, where they bring civility, and then outside of that, of course, it's the wild. It's savagery. And this is why we have one of the most racist terms in our lexicon today, which is known as the wilderness, as if the earth has ever been wild, as if the people who have been living with the earth have ever been wild. So of course it takes a civilized person to go out into the wild, and by going out into the wild, you tame it. And this is what's most important. This is what Europe is going to do. The need to distinguish between us versus them, the need to create a frontier, the need to create a border that separates us and them. Please understand this, because this concept of the border works very fine, especially when you're going to be discussing civility versus savagery. So again, history begins in 1492. Anything before that is anthropology. Now, what are the factors that are influencing the British, the French, and the Spanish to move to the Western Hemisphere? Well, it's Christ and money. Christ and money, they're the operating factors, they're the motivating factors. Once Prince Henry rounds the Cape of Good Hope, the West seems feasible. So, the arrogance of Europe and the Roman Catholic Church can be seen in two treaties. One is the Treaty of Tordesillas, and the other is the Treaty of Saragossa. And in this case, the world is going to be divided by the two superpowers of the time, Spain and Portugal, because Spain and Portugal are the first to move out of the Western Hemisphere. To move into the Western Hemisphere. So Spain and Portugal, if you take a look at the map on the upper map, there's a map of the world, and you'll see that there was an arbitrary line, not that map, it's the other one, the world map. No, not that one, the other one, I'm sorry. There we go. If you see, there is, in Europe, there's this purple line, there's an imaginary line, the line of Pope Alexander VI, all right, and then the line of the Treaty of Tordesillas of 1494. This is where this is where Portugal and Spain split the world in half, one on the west belonging to Spain, one on the east belonging to Portugal. The reason why is Pope Alexander is just drawing an imaginary line on a map, because Columbus founded lands west of that line, whereas the Portuguese had lands from Africa east of that line. The Portuguese were the ones that went down the coast of Africa, rounded the Cape of Good Hope, and went up to India. So the Portuguese are laying claim to the eastern part of the Atlantic. Because Columbus arrived on behalf of Spain over on the western part, then they drew this imaginary line, and they called it a Treaty of Tordesillas. Then when the Spanish arrived in the Philippines, all right, and the Portuguese arrived in Japan, now the Spanish and the Portuguese had to split up the Pacific Ocean. And so they drew an imaginary line again with the Spanish on the west and the Portuguese on the east, and there's the Treaty of Zaragoza, okay? So the world is going to be divided up by these two superpowers of the time, Spain and Portugal. And of course, the native peoples that lived there and the native peoples that lived in Asia are going to be considered pagans with no rights to claim land against Catholic or Christian nations. And that's why Europeans are going to have no mercy nor feel guilt when murdering a native person or when murdering an Asian, because they will be considered non-human. So Christ and money, greed and avarice, how to control labor forces, okay? So again, when we take a look at the racialization process works here. As I shared with you, racism is a very important construct. It's an instrument of power that's used by those in power to perpetuate their power. See, racism ascribes a certain moral, intellectual, and genetic qualities to very real differences in skin color and hair type and in body features. So racism can become a controlling ideology, a set of ideas related to concepts of inferiority and superiority, and they become ingrained as natural. So again, racism and sexism can be considered similar in this way. It's sort of like, racism and sexism is like diarrhea being inherited. It runs in your genes, okay? Now, despite these policies, people respond to change in dynamic ways, okay? So when we take a look at the doctrine of discovery, let's appreciate this doctrine of discovery. Let's understand that this is one of the most racist constructs in terms of the doctrine of discovery. We're going to go to a film clip right now, but let's understand some basic experiences in Native people's lives once Columbus arrives. Yeah. This was the international law that governed European exploration. The doctrine of discovery is that international legal principle that grants European Americans property and sovereignty claims over native peoples and native lands. So once a European power arrives on native people's lands, they plant their flag, and in that they're going to read a statement saying these lands now are under the king, whoever's the king of their particular country. And because of their Christian principles, then all of the native peoples that are on that land become part of their experience. Those are their natives. And so they have to deal with that European power because that European power is laying claim to the lands. That's the doctrine of discovery. Okay? The doctrine provides under international law, that's why they read the statement. You'll always see when Europeans arrive to the Western Hemisphere, they're coming very well equipped, and you'll always see a flag and then perhaps a Christian flag of Jesus Christ, and then another flag of the country. They're laying claim to the area because now that becomes theirs against claims by other nations. So Spain comes in, lays their flag, then they're going to tell the British and the French and the Dutch and everybody else, this is Spanish. So that's why they lay their claim. The British come in, they says this is British, this is not. So they're laying claims against each other. That's why the doctrine works for them, because the doctrine provides that they arrived, and so they acquire the property rights in native lands, and that they get to gain the governmental rights, they get to gain the political rights, the commercial rights over the inhabitants, without the knowledge or consent of native peoples. And this is why the Treaty of Tordesillas and Zaragoza set the pace. And this is one of the reasons why we use Columbus. Why Columbus? Because why we celebrate Columbus is because Columbus begins this process of the Western Hemisphere. Yeah. And so, of course, if native peoples resist, then they're savages. Then you use that notion of the frontier, civility versus savagery. You have to go out and tame the wild. So, let's go to a film clip, and this will end this particular segment.
Today, if I came over to anyone's house and said, I own your house because I'm Bob Miller, I'm superior to you, my culture is superior to yours, my civilization is superior to yours, I own your house. You would not like that.
Well, the Trail of Death was one of those forced removals that took place and involved approximately 800 people, and there were some like 40 deaths.
In the simplest terms, the doctrine of discovery is the idea under international law that when a European Christian country was the first European to discover new lands, they had a legal right to that area.
I think it's important for Mennonites to know that we were a part of that too. You know, our movement didn't kind of come out of the Catholic Church until the mid-16th century. So this was sort of our story as well.
And what was the change? Because a European with a flag and a cross had showed up.
How do we respond to such a doctrine moving towards reconciliation?
I decided that 3 questions get to the heart of what we still need to know. Every white settler ought to know about where I live. Whose land was this before colonization? How did they lose it? By what mechanism and when? And where are their descendants today?
And Rich's, one of his drives and concerns is that he and others are living in northern Indiana on what once was Potawatomi turf.
For the most part, Christians ignore the fact that Christians, European Christians, have committed colonial and imperial crimes and violence, also in the name of God and also in the name of religion.
The religion of empire sees humans as centered in the city as given by God to conquer the earth. The religion of creation sees people springing out of the earth as part of the earth as given by God. These come into conflict throughout the entire biblical period. Jesus sides with the religion of creation against the religion of empire.
I personally hope that we as a church can spend time in dialogue with each other, understanding the dynamics that have occurred, the things that have become norms for us that really shouldn't be norms.
As a scientist, if I talk about values, my work is diminished. The only community of people on Earth today that can deal with these structural issues that are global in scale is the ecumenical community. And my question is, where are they?